questions from the floor? I think we have people with microphones. I can't see microphones, but are there any questions? Oh, there they are in the back. I may start with the first one while all of you are thinking. My question is, you talked a little bit about the challenge of trade in the economic crisis. The U.S. is experiencing 10% unemployment. What signal do you think the United States could and should send to the region that signals continued commitment to economic openness?
Well, that's almost a question and answer for Chris, but look, I think it's fundamental to show that the U.S. continues to be committed to trade, continues to be engaged in trade. Right? You know, we all understand the difficulties you currently have, but the history of this country shows that every time you put up trade barriers, your economy suffers. And yes, there are some impacts, and that's why you've developed, trade adjustment assistance and the rest of policies that have been continuing throughout the years. But this country is the bedrock of the thinking of globalization. My colleagues who are here, who had the privilege of going to school in this country, were taught on the principles of free trade, of free enterprise. The worst that this country can do is turn its back on those very principles that it taught all of us. And so, as difficult as the political challenges are, I think the most important signal is to continue to be committed to the Doha round and successful completion of the Doha round. And as far as this hemisphere is concerned, I think it's very important that the countries that have taken the step to want to integrate further into the U.S. economy, that they can successfully do so by approving some of the trade agreements that are still stuck in the congressional process.
My question is, first of all, the city is a huge supporter of the U.S.-Colombia and U.S.-Panama free trade agreements, and we think they should be
Okay, I'll say this loud and proud. The city is a big supporter of the U.S.-Colombia and U.S.-Panama free trade agreements, and we completely agree those should be done as soon as possible. And we're going to continue to advocate with all the people around the room getting those agreements passed. My question, though, relates to how do we get more trade financing out there? We understand that there's a lot of companies, particularly small and medium-sized enterprises in Latin America and around the globe that are having trouble getting access to trade financing to facilitate the trade investment flows, notwithstanding some of the barriers that are being put up. What is the Inter-American Development Bank doing in terms of creating programs? What more do you think needs to be done by foreign and other, intergovernmental institutions to encourage more trade financing?
Well, this is a very good question. As we all know, a year ago when this whole shock that came about as a result of the Lehman Brothers collapse, one of the consequences was that quickly many of the big financial institutions that were providing trade finance to Latin American countries all of a sudden went to a sudden stop. And literally, trade began to collapse really more through the financial channel than any other. We quickly were able to double the amounts that we finance for our trade finance facility, which today is about $1 billion, but it gets, flipped maybe twice as much, so we get about $2 billion every year. But with that, we basically wanted to assure other institutional investors to follow our lead. And today I would say that, the fascinating thing for Latin America is that this crisis was not financial in Latin America. There were no toxic assets in many of our banks. At the end of the day, as I often mention that, after 25 years and 31 financial crises later, Latin American economies paid no less than 10% of GDP. But we learned all the lessons, the regulatory lessons, and more importantly, the quality of financial regulation. And this is why you find no banking system in Latin America with the problems that you see in Europe or the US. And more importantly, these institutions continue to finance at this time of crisis. And that's the reason that, most importantly, you will see Latin American economies turning around much faster than developed countries. I think, in my view, they're probably about 7 or 8 months ahead of the rest of the world. And that's pretty good news for a hemisphere that many thought in the 80s had lost a decade and that there was really no room for growth. So the issue here is, yes, trade finance is important. It continues to be there, but the biggest impact that we have seen this year in Latin American economies is through the trade dynamic. In other words, the collapse of trade. The Economic Commission for Latin America estimates that the drop in value was as high as 25% in the first half of the year. Probably will get better by the end of the year. But this is the major impact that we have seen. And therefore, trade will continue to be a very important component. And we're seeing, if you look at the numbers of the last quarter, especially in September, we started to see a rebound in not only in trade in general, but more important in volumes of trade again growing, as you can see from containers and other type of indicators. So we start to see a rebound there, and I have not seen the shocks of trade finance that we saw a year ago, but much the contrary, I think is flowing through the system very rapidly. Your question about small and medium enterprises, that's key. And the question is getting down to, to lend to the smaller entrepreneurs. And, Citibank has a big franchise there. It's time to go down the value chain. That's where the real activity is going to be in the years ahead in Latin America.
Well, Mr. President, I want to thank you for being with us today, and more importantly, as representative now of a company that has major investments in the hemisphere, I want to thank you for all you're doing for economic development in Latin America. Thank you for being here.
Ladies and gentlemen, our next panel on the contribution of services to growth